thing. But before that, I want to go ahead and bring Anthony Ferrara up here to talk to you about PHP7 and beyond. So Anthony.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Good morning. It's Friday. It's been a long week. It's been a busy week to see everybody here. Before I kick this off and get started, I really want to point something out. 4 major projects in the PHP ecosystem are having major milestones this very month. This is incredible. Most of these are multiple years in the making. PHP's last major version was over a decade ago. Drupal 8, more than 3 years in the making. Magento 2, more than 3 years in the making. Symfony 3, another major evolution. And I think we deserve a round of applause for the 2 that went gold this week. Magento 2. Now, it's really easy to look and see these kind of successes and these kind of iterations and say PHP is victorious. And say, look at the amazing innovation that's going on in the PHP community, in the PHP ecosystem, in all of the projects associated with PHP. It's really easy to do so. But PHP really as a language kind of sucks. I mean, there's entire websites dedicated to what we get wrong as a language. So why is it easy to sit back and say PHP is victorious? PHP powers 80% of the internet. More than 1 million developers program PHP routinely. It's amazing to watch, but it's also, I think, really important to reflect on why in order to understand where we're going and how we're going to go forward from here. So I view it as 4 different pillars that contribute to PHP's success. There are 4 primary reasons why PHP is where it is today while everybody is in this room together. The first pillar here is the platform, is PHP itself, is the project, it's the programming language. So I want to talk a little bit about what PHP is and what drives the language itself. At the root of it, PHP empowers people. From beginner to expert, from the very first line of code that you write to the most senior person at the biggest companies, PHP empowers you. But also, in terms of scale, PHP is just as applicable at the smallest possible scale website to the largest possible scale websites in the world. And it's useful across all of them. PHP doesn't discriminate. It enables and empowers you to do what you want. But it's also incredibly forgiving when it does that. PHP doesn't tell you if you make a mistake, you're bad. PHP tells you if you make a mistake, I'm going to try to figure out how to make the best out of the situation. If you have a website that you have a sidebar and you have modules on that sidebar, and you make a tiny little error in the code in one of those little modules on the side, your entire site doesn't stop working. You'll just break that little bit of functionality. PHP tries to be as forgiving as possible. And this is really handy, especially for newer developers, because it really enables them to get going and doesn't punish them for mistakes. But most of all, I think PHP, more than any other language in the ecosystem, empowers you to do what you want to do, and it bends to suit you. You know, we talk about in Python the Pythonic way, the idiomatic Python. We talk about idiomatic closure and idiomatic Haskell and JavaScript, idiomatic JavaScript. PHP says, I don't care what you do. Do you like object-oriented programming? Go ahead. Program OO. Do you like procedural? That's 100% fine as well. Do you like functional? Good luck, but you can do that, and we'll kind of stand up and support you here. PHP bends to suit what you want to do with it more than it forces you into what it's strong at. And those 3 tenets, I think, define, in my mind, and to me, what PHP is. But how does it get driven forward? Well, ultimately, PHP started being driven by the needs of the people who built it. Rasmus Lerdorf saw a problem. He was building websites and it was a pain in the neck. So he built a little tiny tool called PHP to make his life a little bit easier. Other people saw this and said, you know what? That is amazing. Let me do that. And they had needs and they had little feature wants, and so they committed it and added it in themselves. The contributors drive the language, and this is true even to today. PHP does not have a BDFL, a benevolent dictator for life. PHP is driven 100% by its contributors. Contributors define RFCs. RFCs drive the language. Now, we have a voting process, but at the same token, if you want to see change, you can do that change. You can make that change. Now, a couple years ago, I got caught up and frustrated with the PHP internals project, and I wrote a post to the mailing list saying, I think PHP needs a vision. We need to rally behind a consistent vision. Some people agreed with me, some people disagreed with me. I didn't make it in the most constructive way. Go figure, it's me. But the interesting thing was I think I was wrong. The more I work with the project, the more I see how things move forward, the more I'm realizing that it's not a consistent vision that is needed. It's the lack of consistent vision that makes PHP what it is today. It's the fact that people come together and make PHP what they need it to be that is the reason why it's amazing. Yes, we do some things for academic purity, but for the most part, we make changes that we need. The contributors make changes that they need. And that is a really, really empowering thought. So it's hard to talk about the future of PHP without talking some specific features. This is the only slide where I will list features, because ultimately it comes down to what people want to build. Some of these things are pretty well known. Async support is one thing that seems to be gathering a lot of momentum in the community, and a lot of people want it. I know people are working on annotations and short closures, as well as things like algebraic types. So you can declare a parameter to be either class A or class B, not be limited to a single type. But these are details. And details ultimately don't really matter. We don't drive development based on a roadmap. We drive development based on what contributors want to do. So it's really, I think we have to pay homage to another project in the PHP community. Several years ago, Facebook open sourced HHVM, Hip Hop Virtual Machine, an alternative implementation of the PHP language. There was a lot of noise around competition, around who's going to win, how this is going to leapfrog PHP. In fact, there were people coming out and saying, internals, throw away the C code base and fork HHVM and make HHVM the way forward. And the realities are that's not tenable. HHVM is built for a specific need. And there are a lot of people who are trying to generalize that need and doing a very, very good job. Sarah Goldman, for example, does a lot of work making HHVM work across the board. But ultimately, every project has different trade-offs. HHVM has to serve the need of very, very large-scale sites, which means some of the things that they do in HHVM actually make it a little bit worse for small-scale sites. PHP, we try to be applicable everywhere, which means we make some trade-offs that aren't good for really large sites, and we make some trade-offs that aren't really good for certain other use cases, embedded platforms, etc. There is a world where both HHVM and PHP live very happily side by side. And that is the world we live in right now. HHVM drives innovation in PHP. PHP7 got a large part of the speed boost, at least tangentially, due to HHVM, because of the way HHVM innovated in arrays internally. PHP7 basically copies a lot of the stuff that HHVM did and innovated. Likewise, PHP7 is innovating in a lot of ways that HHVM is copying, that HHVM is using to make itself better. Competition is good. Both of these projects living side by side empower each other and drive each other. This is not a bad thing. This is one of the most amazing things to happen to PHP in 4 years. But ultimately, PHP depends upon you. PHP is driven by its contributors. It's driven by the people who are involved. It's driven by the people who show up. And every one of you in this room can help drive it. Can I get a guess as to the number of people who have contributed code to PHP7? Anyone have a guess? 700. Wow, that's high. Any other guesses? 1,000. 200. 3,000. No, definitely not 3,000. 12. No, you're not allowed. Being very involved in the project, my gut reaction was probably between 50 and 100. And then I sat down and pulled the numbers, and it's 247. Which, while Drupal 8 is amazing because it has 3,000 contributors, considering you can count on two hands the number of really well-known internals developers, this is amazing. Look around the room. This is they're about that same number of people here in this very room. That's how many people it takes to make PHP. We could easily double or triple that if people would just step up and get involved. And getting involved doesn't just mean committing code. You don't have to know C to contribute. There were 97 people who contributed to the PHP7 documentation effort. There were 38 people who drove major RFCs, major features for PHP7. Over 200 people showed up and voted. And nearly 500 people contributed to discussions on the mailing list. That's really quite amazingly high, but at the same time, quite amazingly low. We need people to get involved. If you care about the future of the project, get involved. So that's the platform. Second pillar here is what I will call everything that's built on top of the platform, the ecosystem. And this goes everything from frameworks like Symfony and Zen Framework and Laravel and Cake and CodeIgniter to things like Packagist and Composer and Pair and PHP classes and everything there, all of the code that's shared, open source and commercial. I've heard it said that PHP is currently in a renaissance, that there's this resurgence of development that's been happening over the past couple of years. And I think that's wrong. Because a renaissance is a period of rapid expansion, of rapid intellectual growth. And I don't think that's what's happening now. I think what's happening is our ecosystem is in a period of revolution. To understand why, we have to get at how projects and frameworks were developed before about 2011. Before 2011, the fundamental problem that people had to solve was dependency management. You had full stack frameworks. The joke was Zen Framework 1 brought everything, including the kitchen sink and a kitchen sink factory in case it didn't work. Composer showed up in 2011 and solved that problem. It made it easy to cherry pick here and there and everything together to the point where the prime problem that frameworks and libraries and packages had to solve was no longer the dependency problem, which allowed the focus to change. So what did this focus change to? What is this revolution towards? Components? Kind of, but not really, because we still have full stack frameworks. Even if they're component frameworks, they're still full stack frameworks. Interoperability is kind of, I think, a better approximation, but that's still really not what's going on. Enterprise and OOP, again, I think these things are distracting. The big thing that PHP, the ecosystem is migrating towards and is having a big revolution towards is solving problems. Because that dependency management piece got solved so well with Composer, frameworks like Laravel, projects like Drupal are able to skip that entire problem and focus instead on the real problem that needs to be solved, on actually managing content, on actually managing information and information flow. And that, I think, is really amazing. But it's worthwhile asking a very fundamental question. When we look at the code in the ecosystem and the way things have been moving in the past 3 to 5 years, it's really easy to say OOP has won. I mean, look, you have questions like this that came up on Reddit the other day. What's wrong with the old style PHP? It really seems like it has. When we look at Packagist, 77,000 packages, almost every single one uses classes, almost 0 use functions. Laravel, #1 framework by popular vote. Symfony, component libraries, Drupal's object-oriented, Drupal's object-oriented, Joomla's object-oriented, and the list goes on and on and on. And it's really easy to say, yep, all modern PHP development is done object-oriented. And if you're not, you're doing it the old way. But that's wrong. And we can show it's wrong because of this simple statistic. Over 30%, over 1/3 of all PHP installs that we can prove are using mostly procedural code. And it's really easy to sit back and say, oh, well, that's a legacy problem, whatever. But I think that completely and utterly misses the point. There are a lot of people building greenfield development right now using procedural code. And the point of PHP and what PHP lets you do is not care. PHP itself as a package, as a platform, as an ecosystem, as a community says, you do what you want to do. We will support you. It's easy to sit down and point fingers and laugh and make jokes, but make jokes while they're heading to the bank. Let's be real here. The power of PHP is the fact that it doesn't care and it enables you to do what you need to do. That's PHP's strength. PHP shines when you do cross-paradigm code. There are better procedural languages in this world. There are better object-oriented languages. There are better functional languages. God, there are better functional languages. But PHP is the only language that truly embraces every way of writing code. It tries to make itself best at doing whatever you want to do. So why would we shoehorn ourselves into one potential answer? Why would we as a community make fun of others for not doing things the same way that we do, that some of us do? PHP really shines when as an ecosystem we come together, and that doesn't mean are the same, that means come together. Now there's a really interesting story that I want to share here. Some of you may know this, but I think this is one of the best lessons that we forgot that we learned as an ecosystem. Back in 2004, PHP 5 was released. Saw almost 0 usage. Fast forward 2 years, 2006, PHP 5.2 was released, saw almost 0 usage. 2007 came around 3 years after a major version which made object-oriented programming a lot easier. And usage was in single digits. In fact, usage was under 5%. 5% of hosts supported PHP 5.2, or 5.0 and greater. Now, projects did not want to take the dive. Frameworks that existed, there were very few that were PHP 5 only, and none of the frameworks, none of the platforms, none of the libraries wanted to make themselves PHP 5 only. And the reason was they risked alienating their user base. There was a fear that if we drop support for 95% of users, we're going to lose those users. And we're going to kill our projects in the process. One man had a genius idea, and this man is sitting in this room right in front here. Larry Garfield. Yes, he looks evil, but he's not. At least, I don't think he's evil. Larry was at a conference in 2007, and he came up with this idea. Well, if one of us risks death by jumping to PHP 5, what if most of us make the jump together? What if we link arms in solidarity and say, we as an ecosystem, we as a community want to push forward? What will happen? And Go PHP 5 was born. Go PHP 5 said, as of, I believe it was February of 2008, any new release, any new major version will only support PHP 5.2 plus. This was about 7 to 8 months from when they started this movement. Over 100 projects made this pledge. Over 100 hosts made the pledge. 200 hosts made the pledge of adopting PHP 5 by this date. In 6 months' time, PHP 5 went from less than 5% support to well over 50% of hosts in 6 months. When we come together, we can change the world. And we showed that. What this was amazing, because this is the first time in the history of PHP that packages and libraries and components and these big communities came together and said, we're going to rally behind something we believe in, and we're going to affect change in the world. It didn't last, though. The project ended, and everyone went back, and the walls went up, and all the projects went back to their own business. And it was several years later, and Larry again was part of the next evolution of trying to break down walls and pull people together. Originally called the Standards Group, now called the PHP FIG, the Framework Interoperability Group. A group rallied behind one of the same core principles of Go PHP 5, that together we are stronger than when we are independent. It's a very hard thing to do. What they are trying to do is probably one of the hardest jobs in programming. They're trying to rally together people and make everybody better. Some projects really take on this full heart and actually pour themselves into it. Some just kind of name someone who's a representative to go and you be a part of this list, but we don't really need to participate. This, though, in my opinion, is the future of the ecosystem. It's interoperability, it's coming together and working together. And again, the future here depends really on you. You can step up and help make this a reality. So that's the first two pillars, the platform and the ecosystem. The programming language, the code. Next up comes people. People make PHP special. Now, I struggled for a while trying to define community. How do you really define community? It's really a difficult thing. They're the people that we see, and then there are the people that we don't see. Are the people we don't see members of the community? Are they not the members of the community? You, in this room, represent the 1% of the community. You are the people who show up. Larry, can you do me a favor? Can you stand up? If this entire room represents everybody who uses PHP, Larry represents the about 0.5% of people who will ever contribute to an open source project. Ever. Rob, can you stand up? The two of you represent everybody who will either attend a conference, attend a user group, answer a question on Stack Overflow, contribute in any way, shape, or form. Now, I want to ask everybody else to stand up if you have contributed to an open source project or community. You're still sitting down. May I ask you why you're sitting? You've done one or two things over 5 or 6 years. That is contributing. You have contributed. Can you please stand up? How about you, sir? Why are you sitting? You're still learning? Okay. Have you ever reported a bug? Okay. Have you ever answered a question? Stand up, please. How about you, sir? You've contributed on Stack Overflow. That's contributing. Stand up. I'll do one more. How about you, sir? You haven't contributed at all. Let me ask you a question. You came to this conference. Did you talk to anybody while you were here? You've contributed, sir. Please stand up. Everybody in this room has contributed. Showing up is contributing. It's not about code, it's about being here. Thank you, you can all sit down. Showing up is contributing. Sharing is contributing. This is what empowers the community and makes this community great. If you're a community leader, if you're trying to build a user group, if you're trying to build an open source project, focus on this. Make it easy for people to show up. Make it easy for people to be there. The rest of it will sort itself out. If you can make it easy for people to show up, you will get contributions and you will drive community forward. So a good friend of mine, Yitzhak Wilroth, you'll know him as Code Rabbi. He actually presented here. He had to leave yesterday, but he presented here earlier in the week. He gives a talk called Talmudic Maxims to Maximize Your Growth as a Software Developer. It is probably one of the best talks I've ever seen in my life. He is absolutely amazing. But he has one slide which I want to share with you. This slide, he's talking about concentric circles of communities. You have the Drupal community, then outside of that you have the PHP community, and outside of that you have coders and solvers and so on and so on. I think this is wrong. And I think this is dangerous for two reasons. One, it implies that every member of the PHP community is a member of the Drupal community is a member of the PHP community. And two, it implies that somehow the PHP community is greater or larger or a superset of the Drupal community. And the reality is that's absolutely not true. It's more like a Venn diagram. We have these communities of people who identify as PHP developers. And I'll pick on WordPress a little bit here. We have a community of WordPress developers. And there is overlap, but it's not a strict overlap. There are people who identify as WordPress developers, and that is amazing. There are people who identify as PHP developers, and that is amazing. And there are people who bridge those gaps, and that is amazing. And you have Symfony and Zen Framework 2, and all of these have different overlaps in different weird ways, but you have people who identify strongly with one community, but participate in others, and that's okay. Then you have things that build upon multiple. The Drupal community in the past, 3, 5, 8 years ago, was very insular. There were very, very few people who talked at other communities, who contributed to other communities. It was mostly Drupal people and, a handful of people who bridged the gaps, but for the most part, it was one community, very strong, very powerful, but isolated. And then about 3 or 4 years ago, things started to change. Largely in part to Larry, but also to several other people who were involved. And now, you have Drupal developers coming to PHP conferences. Not just one, not just two, but a lot of PHP conferences. Almost every single PHP conference, you can find more than a handful of Drupal developers. But the reverse is also true. The Drupal conferences are inviting more and more PHP developers, and those gaps are being bridged. Now, that does not mean that Drupal developers are ever going to call themselves PHP developers. And it doesn't mean that they should call themselves PHP developers. What it means is we should blur the edges to make it easy so that we can learn from each other, so we can communicate and we can share. And the same thing happens with other communities. And in fact, you even have JavaScript here that cross-collaborates with PHP and WordPress and Zen Framework and Laravel and Symfony. It doesn't matter what you identify with. What matters is, do you feel like you can contribute? Because if you want to contribute, you should be able to contribute. And this brings back to this fundamental point. It's up to you to show up and to contribute. It's up to you to bridge the gaps if you want to. You can make everybody better. Now, there's one final pillar I want to talk about, and this one's a little controversial. I call it toxicity. And toxicity makes the world go round. So Tessa Mero, she's no longer here, she had to leave, but she gave the lunchtime keynote on Wednesday. And about a week ago, she had tweeted out, what makes a good open source leader? got a couple of amazing, amazing replies, and then got this reply. What does it mean to be a leader in an open source project? Thick skin. It's kind of sad, isn't it? What about this? This came up on Reddit the other day. I've heard around the boards, blah, 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 people who do custom WordPress functionality aren't real PHP developers. Why? This is bullshit. This is poison. This is toxicity. But I think it's important to talk about why. Why does this toxicity exist? Why does this negativity exist in the community? There's a whole number of reasons, partly because anytime you get humans together, there tends to be friction, and that friction tends to perpetuate itself. But there's a couple key answers, I think, that are really important for us to recognize so we can move past. The first one is this notion of insecurity. I identify with PHP. I am insecure in my identity. Therefore, I project my insecurity onto you. I see your insecurity, and then I make fun of your insecurity because it makes me feel better about my insecurity. Classic projection. Classic human trait. Incredibly, incredibly dangerous. It also gets results, though. This hostility can tend to drive things forward. Now, don't get me wrong, it drives things down, but it can actually result and generate feedback and generate results. So people can actually be motivated to keep doing this, to keep behaving these ways. But there's another aspect here, too. The famous quote, "Some men just want to watch the world burn." The basic definition of a troll. We don't have that many trolls in the PHP community. We really don't. Trolls have one reason and one reason only, and that's to create discourse and to create pain. In reality, what we have is a lot of very heated disagreements. But that is not the same thing as trolling. Trolling has one mission, and that mission is to cause pain. But a lot of people disagree, and they disagree very, very passionately because they feel strongly about something. And passion is something we need to encourage. We need to encourage that passion constructively. We need to find ways of making that passion have positive results. But we shouldn't shut it down and call it a troll. Avoid marginalizing people. A lot of these people who are creating hostility because they're hurting inside. They feel like they're not being listened to. They feel like their voice is not being heard. And when you shut them down, and when you say, "I'm going to ignore you," that actually makes the problem worse. A lot of times, when somebody is frustrated, simply asking, "Hey, are you okay?" is enough to completely and utterly diffuse the situation. Yet we try to fight. We try to make things worse. But it's easier if we try to be compassionate. The toxicity exists because we fight. If instead we try, and we don't have to be perfect at this, we just have to try to make a conscious effort to be constructive, things will be better. Tessa on Wednesday said a very, very powerful quote. "Assume people mean well until proven otherwise." This is a powerful thought, but I'm going to actually take it a step further. Rather than just assuming people mean well, I don't care if they mean well or not. I'm going to assume that they have something constructive to contribute, even if they don't contribute constructively. That basically means even if someone is being negative, even if someone is not living up to their side of the bargain and is actually coming in and causing hostility, find the one thing in their entire heated argument that is a grain of truth that you can use to move yourself and your project forward and capitalize in it. Turn their counter constructiveness into actual constructiveness. And fundamentally avoid labeling people. Once you label somebody, once you call someone a hater, once you call them a troll, once you call them a noob or a purist or a fanboy or whatever, you've put them into a box. all future interactions with them will be perceived as from that box. You've just removed your ability to ever turn that into a constructive debate. You've lost the ability to ever learn anything from that person. Now, all of this I'm saying at a project level, at a community level. If you don't get along with somebody personally, don't interact with them. That is 100% fine. But beware of marginalizing at the community level. Be very, very careful, and be aware that marginalizing someone, being seen as marginalizing someone, actually creates a very, very strong ripple effect and can cause a lot more damage to a community than you may think initially. But it's not all negative. Talked a lot about the toxicity and everything, but this is also an incredibly amazing community. And I'd like to tell you one story about the PHP community that I consider absolutely incredible, hands down one of my favorite moments in the history of my contributions. This gentleman, Joe Watkins, he is a PHP internals contributor. He wrote pthreads, if you've ever used threading in PHP. He wrote APCU, and he's all around an amazing guy. I've considered this man a friend of mine for probably about the three and a half years that I've known him. He is just an amazing individual. About a year and a half ago to 2 years ago, we started to notice that he wasn't coming around as much as he used to anymore. He wasn't around, and when he was around, he wasn't really happy. He seemed depressed. He seemed not with it. So a couple of us pulled him aside and asked him, was like, "Hey, Joe, is everything okay?" No, everything's not okay. What's going on? It turns out his landlord had sold his house. And the new landlord in the UK had filed with the courts and said, "I want to live in this house. I bought it, it's mine. I want to evict you." And the courts ruled in their favor to evict him. So he had 30 days to find a new house. Now, because of happenstance, he didn't have the money in the bank to afford a down payment on a new house, and was basically backed into the corner of moving himself, his wife, and his 2 children into a trailer on a friend's piece of property. Basically, he was going to be homeless, asking his friends for help. And this weighs heavily on anybody. I can only imagine what this would be like for me, yet alone someone with a wife and kids to think about, a family to think about. And it really brought him down. So some people in the community said, "Hey, why don't you ask for help? Why don't you start a Kickstarter or a GoFundMe or an Indiegogo or something and ask people for help?" So he very, very quickly ran off and did that. And he set up the a GoFundMe account and campaign. And then he pinged me in back channel on Google Talk and was like, "I don't know if I want to hit publish." Because the only thing scarier than asking for help is having nobody respond. Well, luckily for him, people responded. In 24 hours, he raised over $20,000. In 24 hours. 400 people who had never met Joe, who most of them didn't know who he was. They saw a community member was in pain, that a community member was in need, and they stood up. And they donated. Joe is happy now. He's contributing. He did anonymous classes for PHP7 as well as a couple other things. The PHP community rallied and got behind somebody who needed their back. And this isn't the only example. This has happened time and time again in the community. We can talk about the negativity. We can talk about the poison and the toxicity. But really, PHP is made from some incredible individuals who are willing to support each other. And it's not just PHP, WordPress and Drupal. I know of things that have happened in both of those communities with the similar side of magnitude. These are incredible communities. When we come together, amazing things happen. Again, this all depends upon you. It depends upon you standing up. It depends upon you showing up and deciding that it's worthwhile to contribute. Now, there's one final thing I want to leave you with. There was a commercial about a year ago that Google put out for Android with a video of a whole bunch of cute animals kind of being together in like weird and cute poses. I'm not going to play the video, But the title of the campaign I thought was absolutely incredible. Be together, not the same. And ultimately, what is a better phrase to describe the PHP community? To describe the ecosystem, to describe why we are all here at this very conference. This is the mission that PHP World, that Eli and PHP Architect are trying to do here. Bridge the gaps between projects. We should be together, but we shouldn't be the same. We should be proud in our individual identities. We should be proud of what we do, but we should be together. And of course, this is PHP, so we'd have to have an elephant in one of these. But we all succeed when we do it together. And honestly, that is why I consider myself really, really proud to be a member of this community and this ecosystem. And I'm really, really looking forward to the future of what we all can bring together. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony.